Vienna Humanities Festival. We're starting this morning, this festival weekend, with a discussion about freedom of expression. And there is hardly a more relevant topic for this festival, which we started back in 2016 as a forum where we bring together intellectuals, writers, academics in the humanities, journalists, in order to rethink our times and the phenomena that shape them. The format of the festival is open to the general audience, so we are throwing their ideas for open debate. So this is to say that after we talk here for about 40 minutes, there will be a possibility for you to take part, ask questions, or reflect on what you have heard. But why freedom of expression is our topic today? You might say, aren't we anyway aren't we part of this minority in the world that is living in democracies, and the freedom of expression is secured, so why bother? Well, we think that the challenges to freedom of expression are new and new challenges, and they're constantly being redefined. So it is important, precisely because the freedom of expression is so central to the functioning of our democracies, to reflect about the new types of challenges and the ways to overcome them. We are going to concentrate today on two types of challenges, one coming from the illiberal governments that are trying to silence independent voices, control the media. It is enough to mention here the assassination of journalists that we have been witnessing in recent years in Malta or Slovakia, or the control of media that we are witnessing, for example, in Hungary, in countries like Hungary, where allegedly about 80% of the media is under state control in one form or another. Correct me if I'm wrong later on. But actually, it is not only Hungary, which is the most famous and notorious example that we read about all the time in the media. I can say that in my own Bulgaria, the country I come from, the last period of about 12 years of political stability was also marked by really complicated, sophisticated schemes that the government was using in order to control media and the content, its content and editorial policies. Actually, Bulgaria ranks even worse than Hungary in terms of freedom of the media, which is peculiar, interesting. And on the other side, the other set of challenges that we're going to talk about today has to do with the rise of the social media and social platforms and the huge concentration of power actually in private hands and in the hands of private corporations, and the responsibilities that come with it, and the danger that these private corporations start exercising censorship. We have two very distinguished speakers today. Incidentally, both of them coming from Hungary, but they met for the first time 10 minutes ago here. Veronika Munk is an award-winning Hungarian journalist, the founding editor-in-chief and head of content development of the independent Hungarian online news daily Telex. She used to be the deputy editor-in-chief at Index, which was Hungary's biggest online news daily, which in 2020, in the summer, she, together with her team, left as a sign of protest of the government putting hand actually on the editorial policy of this media. And as a result, then she created, together with her colleagues, the Telex, which is now actually on a daily basis reaffirming the right of free media and free journalism in her country. Professor ANDRÁS SAJÓ is a former judge at the European Court of Human Rights, a professor at the Central European University, so he is going to be a more frequent guest of this city, starting from now. And he is a member of the Meta Oversight Board, Meta, which was previously known as Facebook. Professor SAJÓ has been extensively involved in legal drafting throughout Eastern Europe, and he has taught in American law schools for a long time. And his latest publications include the Routledge Handbook of Illiberalism. So let us start, Veronika, with this. You have your career started in your country at times when media in Hungary was more freer, more diverse, and throughout the years you have witnessed how the space for independent journalism was shrinking. So can you reflect a little bit about what are the strategies of the government to put halt on independent media and to silence it? And how did the process evolve? And when was the moment when you realized that actually what is going on is dangerous and one has to do something about it?
Thank you very much, Desi, and thank you for the invitation. I will use my phone not to text my family, but I have some notes in it that I would like to use. I think it's very illustrative if we have a look on the freedom of press list of the Reporters Without Borders. They publish every year this freedom of press index. And I started my career in 2002, and then Hungary was one of the countries in the top of this list. For instance, in 2006, Hungary was, I think, the 10th out of like 160 countries. Now we are the 85th, and the year before we was the 92nd. I think we are the worst in the EU, or
no,
maybe Bulgaria, sorry.
Sorry.
you beat us then. What a great thing to be second in this. But yeah, so when I started my career, being a journalist in Hungary was a completely different thing than nowadays, and I experienced this dramatic change. How the freedom of press situation declined. To illustrate this, but in the beginning of the 2000s until in the last 10 years, in the last decade basically, as I mentioned, we worked in a completely different circumstances. For instance, when we asked questions from the authorities or from the government bodies, agencies, politicians, we almost always got answers for our questions, and we were present at every press conferences, and TVs and newspapers and online outlets basically survived only through the market-based advertisement. That was the past, and it's dramatically changed because of, in my opinion, 5 different factors. First was that the Hungarian media landscape basically fractured to 2 distinct parts through ownership. The large majority of the outlets somehow not owned directly by the government or by politicians, but somehow through loyal businessmen, someone might call them oligarchs, they own the vast majority of the media outlets, and there are some of them, some of us, who still independent of it. But this trend in the last 10 years, that are more and more media outlets fell into hands of business circles with close ties to the current political elite, it's constant. And this pro-governmental media conglomerate is very well organized. They have infinite resources versus this smaller critical media sphere that is mostly only online, somehow fragmented, competing with each other, and of course now, like everywhere in the world, hit by this horrible economic crisis. The second factor, or the second strategy, is regarding the public broadcasting companies, the public service media, which is basically, sounds like a megaphone of the government. And there are 7 different TV broadcasters and 5 radio channels, and others belong to just to the public service broadcasting conglomerate, and this is not just the central. This is not just the central one central agency for pro-governmental media sources. There is this large, very unique something called CASMA. The English name is Central European Press and Media Foundation, and around 500 media outlets belong to this foundation, which is supposed to be an independent creation, but it's an institution, I think, with a pronounced government bias. There have been no such media holding in Hungary since the communist era. And I think 500 media outlets is a lot, you can understand that. And so the level of this media concentration, I think it's unprecedented in the world. And I think from the Western point of view is basically, even for us, unthinkable. The fourth factor is that the Hungarian advertisement market somehow also influenced by politics, which means that government-related outlets receive enormous amounts in state and state-controlled advertising, and those who are not allies get none of it. Remember COVID started and all over the world there was this state advertisement regarding wash your hands because then it helps your health. And back then, when it happened, we still worked at Index, which was really the largest and most influential outlet. We reached like 1.5 million readers a day, which is a lot in a country of 10 million. And we never got invited to tell this 1.5 million people a day that please wash your hands. So I think it's a good example that impact doesn't really matter. And the fifth factor is, and as an everyday life, and our everyday lives as journalists is the most problematic of all, is the access to information. You were talking about Malta and Slovakia. In Hungary, journalists are not put to prison and not being killed, luckily. But at the same time, it was never more difficult to fulfill this profession because it's really, really hard to access the information. And it's a constant experience to running up against brick walls when we try to research, when we try to investigate, when we try to basically get answers to our questions. And I don't want to keep too much time, but these 5 strategies are the main ones currently.
Why do you think this is all possible? What were the conditions that made this all gradual capture of the media possible?
It was a very clear political move with a very clear political agenda that. And somehow it's a clever move. It's working if you see the election results in my country. That if you control the media, if you can spread the political message all around in very different kind of media, in TV broadcasters, in female magazines, news outlets, etc., it's just effective. Mm-hmm. So that's simple it is. Mm-hmm.
Professor Sajó, as a human rights lawyer, how do you see the possible strategies to counteract this illiberal government's grasp on independent media? What is the role of the institutions, international institutions like the European Commission, International Court of Human Rights? Are there the institutions there which can help prevent illiberal governments of doing this, what we just heard the Hungarian government is doing?
Well, you know, if I were to know the answer, I would act along those lines that I cannot see. Well, you see, it's very difficult at this stage for a country like Hungary. It's unless there are external changes outside the country, it's hard to imagine. Now, not all the countries reach the level of Hungary. And there I think that there are possibilities, but the possibilities are not built up. And that was also the tragedy of Hungary, that institutional devices were not properly taken when everybody thought that democracy will work very well. It didn't. So you can have institutions, you can have very strict rules, for example, how you depoliticize the judiciary, how you depoliticize the secret services, how you protect the constitution against amendments, making changes of a liberal constitution very burdensome. None of that exists in Hungary, or existed. Now it does exist exactly to maintain the status quo. But I think beyond the unfinished constitutionalization of the defense of a democracy, it's equally or even more so important what is in the mind, what is the spirit. And of course, all what was told about Hungary regarding the media and journalism is true, but it's also true that there were so many willing journalist editors who jumped on this new bandwagon and were ready to support the government. And it's also true that there were lawyers who were ready to carry out the plan. And that's again something that goes way beyond Hungary. So what matters is not just institutions which are not perfect, could be improved, but it's equally or even more so important to have a living spirit, that people are committed. I don't mean that they have to be heroes of democracy, but at least they should take a little risk. And that is what very often is missing, because people just take for granted that the system cannot go down. It does.
But if there is a popular support for this government, for this party that is ruling, and you're saying there are other judges and different people from sectors of society supporting these moves, does this make these measures legitimate?
It is not very fair to blame the people for what kind of democracy they have. But I wouldn't say that the people is not responsible for what they have. So, you know, there are bad guys, and then here we are, the rest. We are not bad, not good, but we should try a little more not to be bad. And what are the social reasons for people acquiescing? Yes, in Hungary or in many other countries, people are increasingly dependent of the state. It's true that in the last 12 years, the number of people directly dependent on state, both business and ordinary teachers, all of them are dependent on the state. So at this moment, it takes a serious risk to stand up, not in terms of going to jail at the moment, but at least in the sense of losing your job, which just happened yesterday in Hungary regarding high school teachers who dared to say something. So it's very hard to say, you should stand up. I'm in many sense enjoying my pension, so I'm in a different position, and it wouldn't be fair to tell them to go out. But, you know, it's still something of a matter of civil courage.
Veronika, but you did stand up, it seems to me, when you left Index and decided to create another media which would be independent. Can you a little bit reflect on, yes, these pockets, even if they are minority in society, that are exercising resistance, and in what way are they doing this? And is there a hope in journalists, in civil society?
Yeah, we did stand up. We quit, all of us, 90 of us quit on a single day after Szabolcs Dóul, editor-in-chief, was fired from Index. But I'd like to stress out that I don't like when our story and our team is being portrayed and talk about like some kind of resistance against the government, but we are not political actors. I don't like that someone put us in that position. We are journalists who just wanted to fulfill this profession that we passionately believe in, that we would like to provide the fact-based news and quality media for people, that we knew that there is a demand for it. And our story that we created, so yeah, we stood up together. And it was unique. After the day we quit, there was this large protest on the streets of Budapest, and thousands of people were marching on the street because Index, our previous workplace, was really, really influential. Everyone read it if they wanted to have credible news. So our only thought was that, okay, the largest possible mistake is that if we do not try. So we tried, and together we founded Telex, which was based slowly on crowdfunding. We thought that, okay, we tried this version when the owner is some rich guy. Now we turn to the readers, and we journalists gonna be the owners, and we just told to our audience that, look, guys, you know us, we have been doing this job since in the last 2 decades, and we want to continue it, not because of this very activist type of move, but for giving facts to you, so please give us money. It was a more sophisticated way how we communicated, of course, but still the message was that. And they did. We got 1 million euros in a month through crowdfunding, so we could start it Telex just 2 months after we quit Index. And Telex is 2 years old tomorrow. That's our 2nd birthday, and it's working. This model is working. There are still enough people in Hungary who willing to contribute financially because they would like to consume facts, and not just at Telex, because I have to mention that there are other independent, mostly online outlets. All of them somehow rely on readers' revenue, because in the end of the day, journalistic independence relies on economical, financial independence. So that's a really important thing in the future, that how we can maintain this stability.
Mm-hmm. But usually when there is a crisis, as there was into the summer of 2020, people are willing to take part and to donate, etc. But what is happening over the years? It's 2 years now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Is this strength of support continuing, and do you think it's a sustainable model, what you're having?
I think the best marketing is a good content and good journalism. So yes, you are right. The big story that, oh, this cute guy stood up, gonna fade. But if we can provide quality journalism for people, today there are 600,000 readers a day at Telex, which is a lot, and there are more than 50,000 people who contributed financially to run Telex, basically. So I can say that we do have advertisement as well, and we would like to grow as many legs as possible. And based on this very strong story we had, I can say that yes, it is sustainable. Mm-hmm. And I'm believing it, of course. Mm-hmm. I wouldn't do that if I won't believe in it.
Moving to the social media and to Meta, can you tell us at the beginning, what is the Meta Oversight Board doing?
Facebook, as it was called at the time, realized that they are under a very serious criticism for whatever they do. If they silence someone or if they allow someone to speak, there was no right way to come out of it. Someone was always offended. Now, on top of that, Facebook promised, as a fundamental service, a kind of safe space, whatever it means. So the idea to have a safe space where no one is troubled, and the idea that they are enabling people to have a voice, which was another promise of Facebook, these two became more and more controversial and contradictory. And at a certain point, Mark Zuckerberg was advised to set up what at that time was believed to be a worldwide Supreme Court working for Facebook independently, because and that means that they established a separate fund. They don't control the money, and we have a board supervising the activity. So if we find that a post was taken down in violation of Facebook standards or in violation of international human rights, they have to restore. And in addition, we have also the possibility to advise them regarding policies. So these are the activities we take. The standard we apply is primarily international human rights law. But that's exactly where the difficulty lies, because international human rights law is not crystal clear. So it stands for freedom of expression, but on the other side, of course, freedom of expression is not absolute, and in particular, incitement, of course, is rightly prohibited. Now, there is a gray zone, which is called generally hate speech, but hate speech has so many meanings that really you get into trouble when you try to enforce it. So, you know, for some people, hate speech is just telling the truth about a certain form of oppression. For others, this is just incitement based on racial or other considerations. So this creates an enormous tension, and the Oversight Board is trying to find a middle road, if you wish, although I think we have a mandate to stand as much as possible favoring freedom of expression. Mm-hmm. But again, freedom of expression has certain limits.
But what is the level that you're working on? Because you're not involved, as far as I know, on the day-to-day community standards moderation. So and how is this being done?
This board at the moment has about, 20-some members, should have 40 at the end of the road. It goes extremely slowly, COVID, etc. And we take only those cases which are particularly important from the perspective of freedom of expression, which means that there are millions of complaints addressed to Facebook. Some of them are remedied, many others are not. They have the right to appeal to the Oversight Board if it's taken down. But then, of course, as I mentioned, we take only very few cases because of the capacity. We are not full-time workers of this foundation. We also have our independence vis-à-vis the foundation. So we have other means of livelihood, not full-time. And so, as I say, very few appeals are accepted by the Oversight Board.
Can you give us an example? What type of appeals would be accepted by the board?
Well, we have rendered in 2 years maybe something close to 40 decisions. In reality, the impact is slightly, I mean, these have enormous impact because these are crucial issues. So we say something about the civil war in Ethiopia. It is just one post that was, I don't want to enter into details, you can read it. We have a website where all the decisions are published. Now, whatever we decided regarding that matter applies to all the information regarding Ethiopian civil war, and it applies, as far as Facebook is concerned, to other civil wars where the situation is similar. So it has a major impact, at least I hope so. Or we have another case now, COVID. Obviously, we decided one case, there is now a policy decision in preparation. So that will determine how COVID misinformation is to be treated, or what amounts to misinformation. So it's really the additional effect that matters. Unfortunately, we cannot provide justice to all the users, but it is really to shape the policy.
So you're defining the standards according to which the moderation is being done on a daily basis. And how is it being done on a daily basis? Is it artificial intelligence, or is it individuals? That I'm asking is because there's so many cases where people are complaining of being censored by Facebook. I have seen, posts where it says this content was not true, so it's removed, and people are complaining because, in their opinion, it was completely correct information.
And even worse when they lose their access as such, so they are,
they can be
as
banned,
users are denied access. By the way, we don't have power to review those decisions at the moment. So the problem, and this is where social media regulation becomes a worldwide problem. You have billions of clicks per day, right? No human capacity exists to deal with it. So who is doing this? It is an algorithm. What is in the algorithm? We don't know. I read in the papers that not even Facebook knows it. I have absolutely no information on this. I just quote what I read. So at a certain point, they lose track. The whole concept that we understand, the whole concept differs from human decision-making because it's not about individual causation, it's about risk-taking. It's statistical risk-taking, okay? So they can adjust the acceptable level of risk, which means that hundreds of thousands of similar statements will fall in the same category. But of course, the conditions are different. So to say something that Group X in Ethiopia is killing us, Group Z, is said in a very specific context where there is an armed conflict going on. Now, what if the same words are uttered in a different context, where they are not yet killing each other, or where there is no such story, or the story is 50 years old? We had a similar case regarding the expulsion of Serbs from a Croat territory, but the expulsion happened 50 years, or no, not 50 years, 100 years and 70 years and 40 years ago and 20 years ago. So how these two compare? This is left to the algorithm. The algorithm does, at the moment, cannot take into consideration all those specificities, right? And that's where this is a completely new world for freedom of expression.
But don't you think that the Meta Oversight Board should have the right to determine the rules of these algorithms?
Well, part of this is proprietary. So, the most valuable thing, and if it's disclosed to us, we won't understand, first of all. I for sure won't understand. Even if you understand.
It can be explained in
we
all
understand
language,
the logic, but how are we going to tinker? They have thousands of engineers to tinker with it, and they do. It's no question about it. They work very diligently. We have evidence of that. So they try to adjust it.
And do you think that small languages are disadvantaged because in English, for example, or Spanish, you have a huge accumulation of cases and it's a language that is apparently generating more clicks, so basically probably the regulations of this algorithm could be better fine-tuned there than in other small languages?
They do this fine-tuning regularly, and we have some data with really considerable financial effort in it. So it's not that that they are idle. No, not at all.
I was just given the sign that we have about 5 minutes more, and then there is time for Q&A, so get ready to ask your questions. But I wanted to ask you also, how do you deal on the Meta Oversight Board with fake news, disinformation, with government's attempt to influence elections in other countries? Is this also something that you are dealing with?
Yes, that's one of the big issues we deal with. Facebook as such, or Meta now, they have dedicated groups to deal with it. They love to outsource this, so they use all sorts of trusted partners to determine, which is another source of problems, because this is always challenged, whether they are objective or not. Now, the most spectacular example, as I mentioned, this is the COVID-related efforts of Facebook. And very briefly, I just exposed the difficulty. So imagine that there is an advice given by WHO, Facebook or Meta takes that word by word. Now, what if 3 months later, WHO comes to a different conclusion? Are you going to restore it? Was the original takedown appropriate or not? Very often, this is not compatible with human rights norm, because there ought to be direct causation of harm. And then there is a debate whether it is appropriate to introduce a lockdown. It's not yet in the public debate. And the WHO says, well, perhaps that's the position, or that was the position of WHO. They had contradictory positions, saying that in some circumstances it poses too much burden on the poorest, which was true. But others said in WHO that lockdown is the only way out in the situation. So what is misinformation in those circumstances when you just debate the introduction of a policy? Are you going to silence all those who have doubts about the policy? So all I'm saying, this is not just a question of algorithm or even sound judgment, because it changes all the time. And that's where the concept of misinformation is people take for granted. Oh, here is truth, here is misinformation, and you just, the water is parted, right? That's not how it works.
I would like to open now for your questions, so please show me by raising a hand if there is a question. So there is one on the back there, and then further to the front, yeah. Please.
Mr. Sajó, just taking up your comment on the alleged expulsion of Serbs from Croatia, in light of the fact that Gotovina was found not guilty by The Hague, in light of the fact that evidence has shown that Serb leaders practiced and told the population of the Krajina to leave, what evidence do you have of expulsion?
I'm terribly sorry, I have a technical difficulty, because in a way we are in this, the microphones are directed that way. So I understand you asked about the Serbo-Croat problem, but right?
If you can shortly repeat the question, the essence of it. What is the evidence they have in order to take the decision in this case?
You mentioned expulsion of Serbs by Croats in light of the fact that General Gotovina was found not guilty by The Hague in 2012. Where is your evidence for this assertion?
Yeah, so the specific case that we had was not about whether someone was responsible or not. So we didn't have to go into that, which would have caused enormous legal difficulties. The case was simply decided on the fact what were the means used to expel people, and then whether the actual post was a clear enough reference to the expulsion, which was irrespective of the responsibility of the military, occurred in a forcible way. So I think the individual responsibility was one thing, and the fact that people had to leave their village, that was a different story. And we were only concerned about that fact, or actually the allegations made in a specific song in that case. So we were safe enough not to get into the international criminal law part of the story.
First of all, I'm sorry I arrived a few minutes late, so forgive me if what I'm about to ask has already been covered. When President Joe Biden took office, one of the things he said was, "Diplomacy is back." And a few months later, he said openly, the whole world knew it, President Putin is a murderer. So from the point of view of freedom of expression, he was allowed to say it, but from the point of view of diplomacy, it was rather unwise and possibly dangerous. So what, in your view, is the borderline, the grey line between diplomacy and freedom of expression?
I don't really heard the question, actually.
That's really
Sorry. So regarding how freedom of expression and the connection to diplomacy. Yeah, sorry, the sound is really strange.
So when President Biden took office, one of the things he said was diplomacy is back. And then a few months later, he openly called President Putin a murderer. So from the point of view of freedom of expression, he's allowed to say what he thinks, but from the point of view of diplomacy, this was rather unwise and possibly dangerous. So what, in your view, is the grey line, the borderline between freedom of expression and diplomacy?
From the journalistic point of view, it is newsworthy. So from the journalistic point of view, if this prominency element that the new president says something like that will be presented in the media. But yeah, but I think it's a totally other aspect if it would be analyzed by the board, or I don't know. So yeah, from the journalistic perspective, it is hard news.
I think it's a question more for political scientists to answer rather than journalists. There is a question here and another here.
Thank you very much for a fascinating panel. My question is about the difference between the countryside and the cities. We know that in spite of Viktor Orban's leadership of the country, that the capital city, Budapest, is in the hands of the opposition. What are the differences between urban and rural ways of informing oneself?
Okay. Yeah, that's an excellent question. Thank you very much. And there is a large difference of the access to the public information, especially if someone do not consume the news online. Because when the media was captured, the county newspapers all of the county newspapers fell into the hands of the pro-governmental business circles. This foundation I mentioned that owns 500 outlets, they own all of the county newspapers, printed ones that traditionally read by people who are not living in cities, but in smaller towns or in villages. That's where the government's voters basically are. And when I mentioned that the Hungarian freedom of press situation is in a bad shape, I mentioned that the media pluralism basically exists online, and people who live in villages or elderly people, they just don't consume, not all of them, of course, there are people who like to read online outlets, but generally speaking, they don't consume these still independent outlets. Therefore, there are some attempts to find a way to deal with this situation. For instance, we at Telex, we started to build a local correspondent network in cities outside of Budapest, so we can give local stories on telex, so people can find from Győr, from Szeged, from Pécs, from we have 5 different locations where we have our own correspondents, and therefore we try to give a different kind of information to people that they can get from pro-governmental media. And there are other attempts similar like that, because it was widely understood that if people do not get that much chance to consume information, but the messages which is pro-governmental, then it can have a problematic effect on the society.
There is a question there, and then.
So thank you very much for the lovely discussion. My question has to do with sensationalism in the media. We see this tendency in the US that the media landscape is more and more polarized. In my home country of Romania, it's the same. There are a lot of private media outlets that always sing the song of one political party and try to slander the other one. And I remember, I also speak Hungarian, by the way, so I remember that it was a similar media landscape around 10 years ago in Hungary, very polarized. And I wonder to what extent people lose trust in a free media landscape when the media becomes very much about slandering the other side and much less about clear policy. So less about informing people. It's a free media landscape, but it becomes much less about informing people and much more about beating down the other side. This, to me, seems to create conditions in which then people want to embrace a more universal message, like what ended up happening in Hungary. So, I don't know. My question is then, has to do, how can we combat this sort of situation from evolving? Is there any mechanism for this?
I would say the same thing that I said before, that the structure you described is so bipolar that there are these pro-governmental media and oppositional media, and I oppose this because I don't think that all of the critical, independent oppositional ones at the same time. There are media which is impartial. Impartiality and objectivity, of course, very theoretical and constructed phenomena which really hard to achieve, but at the same time, not all of the media outlets are tight hands with oppositional parties, so to say, and the purpose is not to beat each other, but to inform people, being curious, being fair. So I think that's the answer. That's what we're trying to do at telex, for instance. And we have the audience basically because they want to have this kind of news product in Hungarian language, also in English. We have an English language section that is the part for the advertisement. If you want to read Hungarian news in English, just have a look at telex. So my answer is that's the answer, to be in the middle as much as possible.
Yeah, but there was one aspect, I think, in the question that I also was curious about. And don't you think that this situation where you have media outlets serving one or another party, as you said in Romania, same in Bulgaria, and other countries, of course, that this erodes the trust in the institution of media in general?
Yeah, that's correct. I didn't answer that part, sorry.
For me, this is the biggest problem, actually, that the trust in the institutions of the media, because when you don't have this trust, then every information is considered as equally plausible, legitimate to be out there, and actually then the social medias are helping every true, not true, false, manipulative, deliberately manipulative information to be spread. And this actually is the end of the trust in the media, it seems to me.
It is declining, the trust, but I think it's a global phenomena. I don't think that there is anyone in the room who would say that if there is a public opinion poll in the country, that which are the most trusted positions and which are the least, journalists would not, in the end of this section, just because of this what's the word in English you said? Sensationalization. Sorry, sorry that I could not pronounce it. And because of clickbait titles and clickbait stories. So yeah, that's a trend we experience, and we try to fight against it with facts.
And are social media for you an enemy or an ally in your work?
I would say it's an addictive love-hate relationship from a news outlet's point of view, because it's a dependent relationship. Because people read news through social media. It's, for instance, Telex's audience is coming through social media, the majority of it. Of course, there are a large proportion of people who type telex.hu and they read it from that, but mostly from Facebook, from Instagram, from TikTok, from YouTube. We are everywhere.
Yes, but then your content is flowing in the sea of all other kinds of information.
Yeah,
right?
and we don't know the algorithm. And we are basically the young sisters of this algorithm. And if a brother wants to turn something or align something which we don't know of, sometimes we realize that our audience is dropping with the same content we provide, and therefore, yeah, it is
double-edged sword, eh?
It is the origin of our existence somehow, because that's how our audience is growing and there. And in the other side, it could kill us in a second.
I think we have time for one or maximum two. Okay, let's take the two last questions together and we round up here and there.
I wanted to ask a question about Google Trends. Media managers around the world are using Google Trends to find out what their readers want to know. So what is the position at your media outlet? Do you consider Google Trends as a source of what people want to read? And do you see movements inside Hungary who want this information that you supply?
You mean Google Trends, right?
Yeah.
No. Because we would write about recipes, cute kittens, and of course I'm joking now. Of course we have a look on what people search for, but in the other hand, the element of newsworthiness, I think, rather differs on what people is searching on Google. So according to our editorial standards, it's not in our focus. Yeah.
There's a question there.
Thanks. On one hand, you have the freedom of speech, and on the other hand, there is the freedom of artistic expression. As we know, there are a lot of not direct restrictions, but to employments and loss of jobs and policy of who leads theaters in Hungary, that there are also many restrictions of artistic freedom. Are you connected with this scene, with people fighting for that?
We write about them. Of course, that's large news in Hungary, and we cover it as a news. But again, we are not. We are not involving as a activist type of involvement. We covering the stories regarding it and give it a voice, let people know what's happening.
Maybe one last question, if it's very short.
Thanks very much. Very short question to ANDRÁS SAJÓ. You said that you don't need to necessarily be a hero of democracy, you just need to be a little more courageous at times, humans, citizens. And I was wondering, as societies become less and less liberal, or liberalism grows, how does one try a little harder, as you said, as a citizen?
Well, frankly, I don't know, but what I have in mind is just the kind of professionalism that was mentioned. And I know a little bit more about judges. And of course, a judge can have very different approaches within his or her professional work. So you can interpret a text in many ways. You can determine the sequence of cases in many ways. That's within your power. But of course, if you are interested in your personal career, then you will try to figure out which case to take first in order to please the superior in your court, because he will decide on the advancement. By the way, here comes the institutional part, because if it is not your court president who will determine your career advancement, then this carrot is not there anymore. But still, it matters how you consider your own work. And it is here that resilience may build up. Same with teachers who, of course, in a country like Hungary, more and more have to follow a predetermined curriculum. But still, in the classroom, you have a certain freedom to discuss a certain historical event or to tell students, oh, here are 3 ways to interpret this piece of poetry. And you can smuggle in at least one meaning that is perhaps not in line with what the government or the educational supervisor expects you to do. So it is at this level that one can still do things. It's limited, but still it matters. And to what extent this works that way, that's where the difficulty lies.
ANDRÁS SAJÓ, Veronika Munk, thank you very much for this talk. Thank you.